Do 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 do. Ba da ba 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 bow. 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 Hey everybody, welcome to the Brunt of It. I am your host Joel Van Brunt. Welcome back, big episode 30. 30. I can't believe I've been at this for 30 days. It's been pretty amazing. Actually, a little bit more than 30 days. But this is very, very fun. So episode 30, if you're going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust? And if you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not let me point you in the right direction to help round out your awareness? I can serve as an aggregator for you with information and how to think about what's in the news, what's in the public discourse, and have grown-up conversations. I don't know about you, but I like grown-up conversations rather than the fifth grade recess shouting matches that we typically see today in the political sphere. So I'm going to help you build discernment and wisdom and maybe control your emotions and help to think more clearly about things. That's what I aim to do anyway. Who would have thought that the axis of kindness and civility would be a niche in today's world? But it is. It's starting to become a niche. There's even pretty famous shows way back in the day, Left, Right, and Center. I think that's still around, but not very popular. But there used to be some civil discourse shows, on PBS and whatnot in another era. And they were respectful. They disagreed. They presented their point of view. And because it was on, television in a limited supply back in the day, then people presumably would watch it. But now, to find civil dialogue, you got to kind of make it up for yourself, which is pretty hard. Who am I? I'm a guy who's got about 21 years of experience between the military, the government, the private sector, small business, entrepreneurship. I've been in a whole bunch of different industries: aviation, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, government, and the military. I've served as an executive in multiple roles, managing people up to about 280 in various capacities. I have hired, I have fired, and I have recruited. I've lived in 16 different locations as an adult, including 8 different states. And that's brought me into contact with a bunch of different cultures: the New England culture, the Southern culture, the Midwest culture, the Left Coast culture, the Hawaiian culture. And my job capacity, whether it's military or in small business, has brought me to 12 different states to work. So I have a pretty well-rounded experience, and I hope that that knowledge base, or that realm of knowledge in all those different fields, will help offer some connections with you. Number one, whatever your background is. I was in engineering. I have a bachelor's of science in engineering, and I have a master's of public policy, and also a minor in performing arts. Musician, play guitar. And I was in LA for a few years as a starving actor. So I have literally done a whole bunch of different things. I've had a great life. I'm also the father of 4, married for 11 years, big in family, 4 young kids. That's tough. That's why I'm doing this so late, because my kids didn't go to bed until just a few minutes ago. Anyway, so in my process, I look at the day's news cycle. I scan everything. I try to look at as much information as I can. That's obviously time constrained because we all don't have as much time as we'd like to, but I get exposed to a lot of ideas on a daily basis, and then I kind of record it and arrange it and kind of structure it in a way that I think will be interesting to you, the viewer. And I've introduced a couple principles in how to think about the news and how to think about the public discourse going forward. And I gave a course on this last Sunday. I'm going to do more on this in the future, but the 3 big principles I want to hone in on, and these were the last 3 of the 5 that I presented on Sunday, are the principles of awareness, the principles of discernment, and the principle of the sticky narrative. So what do I mean by that? The principle of awareness. Are you aware that there's another side? Sometimes you read an article, sometimes you read a piece of information, you watch a cable news show, and the arguments are, they're great, and they confirm your biases and your prior beliefs on a certain topic or issue are just reinforced by this person. but there's no exposure to the other side. Or if there is, it's a caricature and it's a straw man that's pretty easy to dismiss and tear down. I mean, that's pretty common, let's be honest. And honestly, that's kind of how I was in high school, right? You write your paper and you do your topic, your thesis in the opening paragraph. You have your intro, and then you have your example 1, and then you have your example 2, and then you have your counterexample, and then your conclusion, right? And your counterexample, you want to make as weak as possible. At least that's what I did in high school, because it would be easy to dismiss it and to say it's not persuasive. But if you're a real good critical thinker, then you don't do that. You actually challenge yourself by making that paragraph, whatever that is, 4, the one that's the counterexample, you try to make that as strong as possible to, number one, fairly represent the other side, but also that when you find it unpersuasive or unconvincing, that you have a really good reason why. It really challenges you to do that. And so that kind of critical thinking is lacking in today's world, isn't it? I mean, have you noticed that that's lacking? So that's the principle of awareness, is what is the steel man of the other side? The steel man, okay, not the straw man, but what's the steel man of the other side? And number 2, the principle of discernment. So discernment, interrogating that information coming in. What's the purpose? Is it to maybe offer you new information, to make you think differently about an issue, or possibly consider that for how you conclude about a topic or a person? Is it to just simply reinforce your emotional biases? Is it to kind of like appeal to the base? Is it to demonize you or demonize somebody else? Is it to make the speaker or the author look good and look smarter? So there's really this discernment that we need to build, interrogating the information that comes in. Is something being left out? Is there omission? Is there any kind of subtle change in the context? So that's what I mean by this discernment. And then sticky narratives. So I talk a lot about this in my management, my leadership style, that human beings are narrative-making machines. We like to make sense of the world through story. And what we do is this story is not just the big, philosophical and worldview stories, which is entirely true, but it's also the little micro stories about a person or about a department or about another organization. And basically we take data, we take little inputs that we receive in our day-to-day lives at work and at home, family members, and we take those little interactions and we store them up as data points. Then we string a narrative through those data points. And there might be just a few, there might be a lot. It might be daily, it might be monthly. And so whenever you inevitably string that narrative through those data points, you are likely, and I would say, dare say, all the time, going to be excluding data that you're not aware of that might be pertinent in how you think about things. So that's the narrative that we form. And then once we do that, it's pretty sticky. It's pretty sticky. We try to make sense of information coming in and fit that in the narrative, to include manipulating the information coming in and kind of change the meaning, or we reject it and dismiss it and kind of push back against it, and then go back and reinforce our prior beliefs and prior thoughts about this narrative because we're comfortable in that story. And if things make sense in our minds about a person or a department or a subject, then we're more comfortable. But as soon as that gets challenged and things start to get uprooted in our minds, we start to get uncomfortable. We get anxious. We get maybe stressed out, or our cortisol levels go up. And we don't like that. So we like to keep things, not really that complicated in our brains. So that's the principle of sticky narrative. So if we keep all these things in mind as we look at, big topics, what's in the news, what's in the public discourse, what are the big issues of the political season, then that's going to help us. That's going to help us to better understand it, to better understand our own interactions with things. And anyway, that's my goal. And I think that we can do that in the context of adult conversations and grown-up conversations, as opposed to, like I said, those 5th grade recess shouting matches. So kicking off COVID improvement plan. So I am now back at work, and I'm splitting time actually physically going in. We are deemed a critical business, and also telecommuting. And so so my 1% improvements, I've been day trading when I was really stay at home and unemployed. And this morning was rough. I I did have 2 positions that I sold for pretty good gains, but I had 2 other positions that I'm starting to turn into a swing trade, and they've fallen off pretty significantly in the last 2 days. So we'll see how that works out. I'm trying to see how my emotional state plays into the decision making about, when to cut the losses, how to cut the losses, trying to take in as much information as I can with regard to that. So it was a rough trading day this morning. And, like I said, I'm working full time now, whether it's at home or at the office. And that's presented some challenges because it's harder to, throughout the day, nail down material and things I want to talk about in this live stream. So I'm trying to get more efficient and more concise. And since I've been doing it for a while, I'm comfortable with some of the themes I want to continue on throughout this. I have a whole bunch of ideas that I'm trying to catalog and get down for future content. But that's the thing, and I'm trying to constantly learn and improve as part of that 1% growth that I've talked about before. So, in today's economy, with the stay-at-homes and the lockdowns, we have Google Meet, we have Zoom, we have all these telecommuting tools and webinars, and of course, I've been starting to do that myself with people that I'm hiring back on in my direct reports. And this was a really good, interesting lesson today, is that, we're hiring a lot of people back, but we have not much demand. And so we have to figure out ways to keep ourselves occupied, to grow, to improve the internal structure of the company, the processes, the procedures, do improvements on the spaces, the office spaces and whatnot. And that includes the managers. That includes me. I have special projects I want to do, or I want to crank away on a computer and look at the form we have and the existing process, stepping through the chain and top to bottom kind of recreate some things. And because I have some technical skills on the computer, in some cases, I'm the best person to look into some of these technical solutions. There's other people who have some level of knowledge, but for some of the stuff we're trying to do, I have the level of expertise to do it. So there's a balance between the projects you want to work on, and then making sure your direct reports have enough guidance to keep themselves busy, and enough structure to keep themselves busy, enough knowledge, enough structure so they know, for maybe Monday through Friday for at least 1 week, they have, hey, here's priority 1, here's priority 2, here's priority 3, here's priority 4, with very little oversight. You're basically at home, working from home, get these things done, plus a couple special projects. So I was talking to my direct report today, and there was a really good learning point that came out, and he was sharing with me some challenges because all these ideas were getting generated, which was the first ask of the people, was to, hey, identify low-hanging fruit. What are easy wins we can do to improve our processes, our spaces, anything else that you can think of, our professional development. And all these ideas were getting generated. And one of my direct reports was sharing with me that he thought that for some reason he was getting a little bit defensive with some of these ideas. And I understand that. I've gotten defensive too about ideas. And I thought about it and I said, well, why would I do that? And what came to mind was, if I have these projects I want to work on, and I know roughly the amount of time I need to set aside to work on these projects, but at the same time, part of my job is to make sure I have enough structure communicated to my team so that they can be successful, so they're not constantly asking me questions about what they should be doing, then there's like an order of priority. I know the projects, but I don't need to start them until maybe next week, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe a few days. And I got to spend my time now really honing out that guidance and the priority list for my team. So I can hand off the list that should answer most of the questions before they're asked. And then that'll free me up with enough time to go back and work on my project. So that really came to me, trying to hold both together at the same time can be stressful, right? If you don't think about it in a sequential manner. And so that conversation today was good because it clarified my thinking on, what is it that causes stress in our minds as managers or as leaders of a team. And that popped in my mind. Well, if you have a project you're working on that requires some skills and to, grind away in a computer, and yet you're still being looked to provide structure and leadership and guidance and set the tone for your team, you really have to prioritize that. And if you're trying to do both at the same time, it can be stressful. So that was a good discussion today. And it reminded me just a little bit of a military story that I had. So I was deployed to combat. This was a long time ago. And about 2 months into the deployment, my commanding officer was relieved. He was fired in combat. And the person who came in, the squadron, most of the squadron people, at least my generation, I was a captain in the military at the time, most knew who this person was. So he came in and took command, and we had a huge amount of emotions. We were shocked. We were upset that we lost our CO. We liked him. He was a funny guy, nice guy. But we also knew his replacement, who previously was in our squadron, and everybody liked him as well. So we were kind of sad to see the old boss go, but happy to learn who his replacement was. So it was a variety of emotions. And there was a little bit of a malaise in the unit that no one could really put their finger on for a few weeks. And it wasn't clear how much of that was from before the change, the CO getting fired, and how much of it was maybe a result of that event. That part was, undoubtedly some of it existed before, but probably because of that event, there was some of that event caused some of this malaise and kind of just something off in the culture of the organization. And I remember maybe a week or two later, the new commander sitting up in front of everybody and saying these words. He said, "What this squadron lacks is structure." And when he said that, it was a very, very short sentence. He used the word structure. What we lack is structure. And boom, light bulb went off in my brain. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And perhaps you've had those moments in your life where you can't really articulate what it is that you're discerning or you're detecting until you hear somebody or read something and you go, yes, that's it. And it gives an articulation to something that you know is going on kind of at a gut or at a emotional level. So that kind of reminded me, the whole structure and how we're structuring our time in this small business that I'm a leader with. So anyway, some good positive 1% improvements in the job front today, from what I would say. I listened to a webinar yesterday on healthcare in Hawaii, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And the scope of the discussion was the impact of things like the excise tax, the general excise tax, which is imposed on independent doctors in Hawaii, and how that's led to a flight of doctors away from the state. And out of the analysis presented, one of the staggering numbers was that the state has about 830 physicians less than what they should in order to have a pretty good caseload per the population. And one of the reasons was because with a small business model from independent physicians, not at a hospital, the hospitals are exempt from this general excise tax, and thin margins, and the lowest, what I was told was the lowest reimbursement amount for Medicare out of any place in the country. I think we're number 51 is what they were saying, which is crazy, behind Washington, D.C. So these small businesses have razor thin margins, razor thin. And it was something like out of every dollar, maybe 20 cents, maybe 15 cents goes back to the small business. All the rest is taken up in the taxes and paying staff and other expenses. So the result of this panel was discussing that this excise tax was leading to these doctors leaving the state, not wanting to come here in the first place, and as the population of Hawaii increases, the shortage is getting worse. So it was a panel of doctors, and it was all in a webinar, Zoom. I think it was a Zoom meeting, and I asked a question, and my question was, okay, let's say that the excise tax is adjusted or amended for physicians. What about Medicare for all schemes? What would that do to the doctor shortage? Would that be a separate issue? Would that continue to have people leave the state? What would that look like, a Medicare for all scheme? And the answer was pretty interesting. One of the doctors said, well, all independent doctors would be out of business within 90 days. Because, and he alluded to that fact that was presented earlier in the conversation, that Hawaii has one of the lowest reimbursement rates of Medicare. And then they said, well, Medicare for all is kind of a misnomer. It's not really Medicare for all, it's Medicaid for all, which is that insurance for the poor that the states run. And the Medicaid situation in our state is even worse. It's even worse than the Medicare situation. So they brought up one other point that I thought was interesting, and I'm going to do a show on healthcare at some point, and some other issues, but just because it's fresh in my mind and from yesterday. So the tax scheme had direct impact on the decision-making of doctors, which may surprise you if you never heard that, but there are in fact incentives that small businesses, regardless of type, will follow based on the tax scheme or based on the loan. And we sat down and strategized how to go through the PPP for literally 2 days. And there's been a lot more work than what I've been involved in with some other parts of the ownership. So I thought that interesting. So the tax incentives, and then the Medicare reimbursement, and then liking Medicare for all to the Medicaid program, and then the advocates for these programs in the physician world, in the medical space, are overwhelmingly from academic institutions where they draw a salary from an academic institution. And they're not necessarily tying their salary to reimbursement rates in an independent sense, like a lot of, independent physicians who might be out in a clinic, in a specialty clinic and whatnot. So the critique was that the overwhelming voice, and they put estimates of the percentage, 70%, let's say, of the vocal proponents of Medicare for all in the medical profession are not in the small business practices. They're not. They're in more these academic institutional settings where they have guaranteed income, and they're not really practicing medicine like an independent physician. So I thought those were very, very interesting as well. And it made me think that, discussing solutions about healthcare should be without emotion. We should really look at these things like incentives and look at the pros and cons of a Medicare for all scheme, like the Democratic nominees are proposing. Now, I don't believe that Joe Biden has that, but he has an expansion of Obamacare. So some sort of maybe slower transition to that place, perhaps. Anyway, so I'll do more on that at a later date. I just thought I'd mention that was a really interesting intellectual thing to sit through yesterday. And then I really love learning new things, and kind of in line with incremental improvements, and constantly taking in information. I listened to an interview on Scott Adams' podcast this morning, interviewing Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report. And Dave Rubin's coming out with a new book called "Don't Burn This Book," which is a pretty funny title. And there's a lot of interesting, cool ideas that I got exposed to in this interview. And I want to just share a few of them. First of all, there's this physicist. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. His name's Gell-Mann. That's his last name. And he had this idea on fake news. Now, I've tried to find this reference in Gell-Mann's work. So this is a secondhand. This is, what Scott Adams' podcast says that Gell-Mann says. So there's a little bit of is it hearsay? Yeah, I think a little bit of hearsay in this. So take it for what it's worth. I haven't been able to find these quotes actually, but Gell-Mann basically says that if you're an expert in a field, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't know the original quote, but if you're an expert in a field and you read an article or a piece of news on your field, you'll clearly, easily be able to pick out the errors and the inaccuracies in it, and the fake news portions of the article. And then if you read an article right next to it that is outside your area of expertise, then the information presented in that article, you'll just take as true. And this is an interesting observation of human psychology, that it's easy to find the errors of things that we're really comfortable with, and then things that we're not comfortable with or familiar with. And if it's getting presented as new information, we're going to more emotionally identify with it, and whether it confirms our prior beliefs or not. So that was and that's right in alignment with what this whole show's about. So that was a really cool, interesting piece of information I got. Another piece of information, and this is from Rubin. I guess he has four areas of fake news, and I don't know all four because I haven't read the book yet, and I think I might get it. But one of them was, does the story match the headline? Does the story match the headline? So the headline says this, and then you read the story, and you're like, that's kind of not what the headline suggests. And so what was discussed is how people understand that the audience, many, will not read past the headline. They'll glance the headlines because they have limited time, and they'll have an emotional reaction to the headline that confirms a prior belief. And they don't go further than that. Not because of ill intent, they just don't have time. Maybe they're, swiping things on their phone when they're waiting for the meeting to start, or when they're waiting for their kids to finish, brushing their teeth so they can put them to bed. So limited time, you can only scan the headlines, and the discussion was on how this, people are not dumb about this. People know that they won't dig below the surface of the headline. Many people, not all, but many. And so that can be exploited. One form of fake news is, does the story match the headline? Another one is, the story too perfect? Is the story too perfect? So this was the Jussie Smollett story as an example. So does everything kind of fit the narrative just a little bit too much? Because if that's the case, then maybe you need to be pretty skeptical of that claim. And then on the flip side, if it's too hard to believe, then it probably didn't happen. You might want to allow more details to come to light before you commit to this. And this introduced me to a blogger named Scott Alexander, who's apparently a psychiatrist, and he blogs for this site. He blogs for this site called Slate Star Codex. I've never heard of this guy. I'm sure his ideas have been, I've come across his ideas before, but I started to read his blog, and he's a really deep thinker and a good writer. So now that's another piece of information I want to put into my kit bag, and a person I want to read and be familiar with his thinking, because it's good. And he basically, I'm paraphrasing again because I couldn't find the direct quote, but it was, if something's too hard to believe, it probably didn't happen. And then this all kind of reminded me of my own kind of sense, my own filter that I've kind of developed, and that is the emotional filter. So if you recognize a headline or story as, boom, activating the emotional response in the public, one side, the other side, and one side is, that's exactly right, and the other side's like, you guys demonize and blah blah, out of context, and it really, brings up the walls and fights on, then that's a trigger to just kind of give it 24 hours, because oftentimes the story 24 hours later has a lot more context than the initial first contact with the story. So that's kind of my own emotional filter that I apply. So like for the Jussie Smollett thing, I waited for like 24 hours or 48 hours because I was like, something's weird about this. I just don't want to commit one way or the other. If it happened, it's horrible. If it didn't happen, that's also horrible. But I really can't know which one's the case. So that, all this to say, hearing this interview helped to clarify some things, and also to kind of validate my own emotional filter that I have of just delaying, allowing time to help mitigate against strong emotional commitments that may be a little bit premature. All right, so getting into COVID updates, and I'm going to talk about headlines in a second, because these were off of one of my favorite aggregators, Real Clear Politics, and I just thought I'd run down a few, because I just thought it was so interesting how these were presented. So let me pull up the aggregator. I thought I had it open, so I apologize, but it's okay. So the first one is from Real Clear Politics, and the article is titled "As We Reopen, Is Sweden a Model for the Way Forward?" So that's on the aggregator, right? And then when you open the article, it's slightly different. As we mull leaving lockdown, is Sweden model the way forward? So that's slightly different, right? Is mull leaving lockdown versus as we reopen, is Sweden a model for the way forward? So I noticed that, but it's pretty close. And in this, it talks about, what Sweden did, and we've covered some of this. I covered this interview with a famous Swedish epidemiologist like last week or so. So the Swedish Public Health Authority is elected to pursue what it regards as a feasible goal of slowing the spread to prevent the overwhelming of its healthcare system while protecting the most vulnerable populations. Commentators in the media have accused the Swedes of pursuing a risky coronavirus strategy, or of Russian roulette-style COVID strategy, that has caused an alarming acceleration of the pandemic, triggering a death spike leading to 10 times the number of deaths than the Nordic neighbors have seen. These commentaries seem to extrapolate too much from a narrow view of the data coming out of Sweden, or are under the false impression that Sweden is not socially distancing and simply allowing the disease to spread. In fact, recent reports claiming an acceleration in COVID deaths in Sweden appear to be based on misconstruing the data at hand and narrow comparisons to other countries. And then this article goes through the 3 different methods of reporting in Sweden, of how they report COVID deaths, and how they're slightly different. And the graphing of them shows slightly different numbers. So he goes through that analysis, and then he talks about, and then kind of wrapping all that discussion up, he says, sooner or later the lockdowns must end as people become more afraid of losing their livelihood than losing their life, or as other overlooked mental and physical costs pile up to the breaking point, cure being worse than the disease. In the absence of effective and widespread vaccination, the viral spread can be slowed but not stopped. Singapore, for example, initially did well at containment, but now new cases are appearing. It is possible that Sweden's larger initial wave of infection pulled forward infections that other countries are likely to encounter in subsequent waves as those nations' lockdowns are inevitably relaxed. Indeed, Dr. Michael Ryan, Executive Director of the Health Emergencies Program at the World Health Organization, suggested that perhaps Sweden represents a future model of what post-lockdown society might look like. Okay, so that's one. And then what I like about Real Clear Politics is it puts two kind of opposite headlines together. And so just underneath that headline is this headline: America must stay closed. I will not die of stupid. And this is from Leonard Pitts, Detroit Free Press. So same thing. You go into the article, and I really need a mouse to not click on things I don't want to, but I digress. So that's the line in Real Clear Politics, but then you click in the article and it just says Pitts, I will not die of stupid, opinion. So it's slightly different. So there's no America must stay closed. So I think that's just offering the counter perspective. So Pitts has a way with words. I'm just going to read the first couple paragraphs. Someday I'm going to die. This I grudgingly accept. I have no idea how it's going to happen. Maybe I will die of having a tree fall on me, of eating tainted shellfish, or of being struck by lightning. But this much I guarantee. I will not die of having wagered my life that TV carnival barkers, political halfwits and goobers in MAGA hats know more than experts with RNs, MDs, and PhDs after their names. In other words, I will not die of stupid. Not that there aren't plenty of opportunities to do so. Indeed, in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the question of when and how the nation's economy should be reopened, we seem to have tapped the U.S. strategic stupid reserve. The result has been truly awe-inspiring display of America's matchless capacity for mental mediocrity. Surveys show, for instance, that a solid majority of Americans, 63%, according to a CBS News poll, are more worried about reopening the country too fast and worsening the pandemic than opening it too slowly and worsening the economy. Yet a noisy minority of protesters is furious at government for trying to keep them healthy. They demand their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of acute respiratory distress. So, colorful language. This is actually entertaining writing, but you can see how just polar opposite, those previous two were. Let's do two more. This time from The Week, and this article in Real Clear Politics is I can't remember what the original title was, but the actual title is "Republicans Literally Want to Work Americans to Death," and I saw that and I was like, "Well, that's not good," and so I was actually trying to find that in the article to see what they were saying, and kind of like what I alluded to earlier, make sure the story matches the headline. I thought the headline might be a little bit over its skis in this story, so let me read a little bit of it. Okay, the Republican Party represents regular working stiffs, the forgotten men and women of America who have been left behind by the country's effete liberal elites, or at least that's the message that President Trump, GOP leadership, and the American right in general have been pushing for years. But while their words are one thing, their actions are another. And the actions of Trump and his fellow Republicans during the coronavirus pandemic suggest they see American workers as nothing but cannon fodder to be sacrificed in the name of rejuvenated economy. The most recent example was the president's executive order from earlier this week, telling meatpacking plants to remain open. The industry, which involves thousands of often poorly paid workers laboring shoulder to shoulder at processed and packaged poultry, pork, and other items, has become a hotspot for COVID-19 outbreaks. Facilities are shutting down. At least 20 workers in meat and food processing have died, and thousands have either been infected or have self-quarantined. Pork and beef processing has already fallen 25%, and the Trump administration was concerned capacity could be cut by as much as 80%. The president's decision, no doubt, was influenced by an ad taken out by the chairman of Tyson Food Company this weekend, warning that America's food supply chain is breaking. So, there's other explanations as to why Trump would, offer this executive order for keeping meatpacking plants open, other than labor as fodder to rejuvenate the economy. Anyway, so that was an interesting example of the article not really matching the headline. So he goes on and he talks a lot about the meatpacking, and the safety protocols that are in place for these workers. So he goes a lot into that, but indeed, workers must be effectively forced to return to the job, which brings us to unemployment insurance. One of the most important parts of the CARES Act was a major boost to unemployment benefits to keep individuals and families financially whole as the statewide shutdowns eliminated jobs. The catch is, to be eligible for unemployment benefits, a person must not have lost their job involuntarily. In other words, once a state ends its stay-at-home orders, workers who decide to remain away from their jobs for fear of the coronavirus will not be eligible for unemployment insurance. So this is an interesting discussion, but he's using this as a cudgel to beat the Republicans on getting back to work or reopening the economy. And then he takes aim at the Republican-dominated states like Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and whatnot. So that's really it on this article. I thought there was one more piece I wanted to discuss, but reviewing it, I don't. And then the next article is, and I think I remember where these were in the Real Clear Politics thing. Yeah, so Republicans literally want to work Americans to death. And that's the one I just read. Then the other one, the counterpoint, is Democratic officials are conducting dangerous experiments. Okay, so you click into this article, and it's basically a slightly different article at the top of the page. And the title is Blue States Become Laboratories of Despotism. And it basically, it's by David Catron, and it's from The Spectator, the American Spectator. So it primarily talks about Gavin Newsom's recent developments and recent actions in California. So California Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, has refused to say when his stay-at-home order will expire, even in purported reopen plan that he announced last Thursday. When asked when the Golden State residents would be able to exercise their First Amendment right to attend church, he vaguely replied, months, not weeks. In addition, Newsom was evidently so incensed by the number of people who went to the beach last weekend, he decided to order all Orange County beaches and state parks closed to the public, effective May 1st. Such decrees have provoked increased impatience with Newsom, including a rant from Elon Musk, whose Fremont Tesla factory is shut down. And then this is a quote. This is the time to think about the future and also to ask, is it right to infringe upon people's rights? I think the people are going to be very angry about this and are very angry. It's like somebody should be. If somebody wants to stay in the house, that's great. They should be allowed to stay in the house and they should not be compelled to leave. But to say they cannot leave their house and they will be arrested if they do, this is fascist. This is not democratic. This is not freedom. Give people back their freedom. Predictably, Newsom is the defendant in several federal and state lawsuits, plus at least one class action suit. 3 Southern California churches have filed a federal lawsuit arguing that governor's shelter-in-place order violates their First Amendment right to freedom of religion. As their attorney puts it, if a Californian is able to go to Costco or the local marijuana shop, he or she must be allowed to practice their faith. 7 small businesses have sued Newsom, alleging that the lockdown violates their civil liberties. Also, the American Spectator's own Ben Stein, who lives in the Golden State, has joined a FreedomWorks class action suit against Gavin Newsom. So the article goes on to expand this out to other Democratic governors in places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Delaware. Massachusetts, even with a Republican governor. And and that really the states that are not doing this and kind of doing the partial reopens are all the Republican governors. So, experimentation and despotism, which, 50 states, 50 different courses of action based on the unique circumstance of the state. And anyway, that's the angle that this article takes. So I thought I'd open with that because it really does show kind of where the two sides are and how far they'll go to reinforce their own perspective. And really the truth is somewhere in the middle, don't you think? I mean, it's not clear that opening up timing-wise is the best. We just don't know. And it's not clear that we ever had to close down in the first place. Now, social distancing and controlling the flood into the medical facilities, I'm all for. I'm all for that. And if we had to close down for a short period of time to make sure we didn't do that, yes. But in the absence of a vaccine or a viable treatment, we're not going to stop this disease. We just can't do that. We can't just shut down the economy for 18 months. And I've been talking about this for the last several days. So more fog of war information. So the AAPS, which, do I have that open? I hope I have that open. AAPS, yes. So AAPS is the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. And they have an article that came out yesterday called Hydroxychloroquine has about 90% chance of helping COVID-19 patients. In a letter to Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons presents a frequently updated table of studies that report results of treating COVID-19 with the anti-malaria drugs chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. To date, the total number of reported patients treated with or without zinc and the widely used antibiotic azithromycin is 2,333, writes AAPS, in observational data from China, France, South Korea, Algeria, and the U.S. Of these, 2,137, or 91.6%, improved clinically. There were 63 deaths, all but 11 in a single retrospective report from the Veterans Administration where the patients were severely ill. All but 11 in a single retrospective report from the Veterans Administration where the patients were severely ill. The antiviral properties of these drugs have been studied since 2003. So anyway, it goes on to defend this position that we should start using the hydroxychloroquine, which has been, the bane of Trump's existence because he suggested this early on, and then there wasn't a whole lot of forthcoming scientific data to suggest it works. But now you have a panel of doctors, an association that is actually suggesting that we do this. So we'll see. We'll see if the science kind of backs up the story in the days and weeks to come. But I present this because it's not really being reported anywhere else. It's just a simple article from an association of doctors. So will it get picked up and discussed more in the future? Yeah, probably, especially if there's some promise. And I'm not sure if the methodology that they're using is good because they're kind of aggregating a bunch of numbers and then drawing a conclusion from it. And I'm not sure that that really works. If you aggregate a bunch of different studies studying this thing and just put all the patients together and then draw big comparisons, I think that's probably a fallacy. But wouldn't it be interesting? This is kind of the fog of war. So even if this is a false report or not a false report, but inaccurate report, this is leading to the fog of war, where you have different competing ideas, contradictory ideas from different experts, different health professionals, different disciplines, and they don't agree. And it's difficult to know which one's right. But we still have to execute. We still have to make risk decisions. So remember that. Even in the fog of war, you still have to make risk decisions. This is what combat is all about. I was introduced to the fog of war concept very, very early in my military career. And it's so true in combat. Having been in combat, it's very, very true, this fog of war. But with the way the political discourse is and the way issues are, and especially the way that Scott Adams talks about two movies on one screen in people's minds in today's world, seeing the same set of facts and coming away with completely opposite perspectives and conclusions, we couldn't. It's almost like we couldn't be more apart. And I feel like this is the fog of war, where we have competing information, contradictory information. It's confusing. You're not really sure what to trust out there. And by the way, this was a family member of mine confiding in me a few weeks back that's why she's not that political, is because she doesn't know when a news article is just trying to, spread fake news. If it's accurate, she doesn't have the time to validate it or check its creds. So she doesn't like to engage in it because she's not sure. She's trying to be protective of what comes into her mind. That's kind of smart. Okay, moving on to politics. So Trump's approval rating is now, according to Gallup, has come up by 6 points, I think. So President Trump's job approval, this is according to The Hill, President Trump's job approval soared to 49% in a new Gallup poll released Thursday, making up a 6-point loss from a similar survey just 2 weeks ago. The new approval number is tied for Trump's personal best in Gallup's polling data. A survey conducted by Gallup in mid-March similarly found his approval ticking up to 49% before it took a 6-point dive in the first half of April. The poll released on Thursday marked a rare instance in Gallup's polling history in which Trump's overall approval is above water. Only 47% of respondents said they disapprove of the job he's doing in the White House. This is the most interesting. The 6-point jump in Trump's approval rating owes primarily to the bump in support among independents. According to Gallup, 47% of independents said they approve of the president's handling of his job, compared to only 39% in the previous April study. Among Republicans, the president remains overwhelmingly popular. 93% said they approve of the job he's doing in the White House. He remains highly unpopular with Democrats, only 8% of whom said they approve of his job in office. So that's interesting. Now, Real Clear Politics still has him down. So this is simply one poll out of many. So take that for what it's worth. But I want to move on to the Flynn story. So as you've seen this develop, of course, Jonathan Turley came out in the Hill and said that this should be dismissed. Public saying this, and he's a famous constitutional scholar out of Georgetown, I believe. So I wanted to read a little bit of another Hill piece by Andrew McCarthy. He always has really good analysis. And I always talk about following journalists and not news companies, but follow individual journalists, because you can kind of discern, that principle of discernment. You want to discern the ones who are good thinkers that aren't going to just present a fully one-sided viewpoint. They're going to think critically and fairly as best they can, and try to be as honest in their reporting as possible. So Andrew McCarthy, I would recommend following him. But let me read a little bit of this. So the Department of Justice's letter to Sidney Powell, who's Flynn's current lawyer, who has persisted for months to pry exculpatory evidence from DOJ, indicates that further revelations may be forthcoming. For now, the disclosure has two salient aspects. Now listen carefully to this. The first involves the factual basis for the Obama-era FBI's investigation of Flynn, or rather, the lack of a basis. Under federal law, a false statement made to investigators is actionable only if it is material to the matter under investigation. If there is no basis to believe Flynn had committed a crime, his counsel could have argued that any false statements allegedly made by Flynn when he was questioned in January 2017 were immaterial. Ergo, Ms. Powell contends that the withholding of this information violated the government's duty to disclose exculpatory evidence. It is the second aspect I want to home in on, however. Powell and other champions of Flynn's cause have long claimed he did not lie to investigators, a claim supported by the interviewing FBI agents, who concluded that Flynn had not made intentional misstatements, just failures of recollection, which are common. Instead, they maintained that Flynn was coerced into pleading guilty nearly a year later by special counsel Robert Mueller's team by hyper-aggressive prosecutors. Prosecutors did this, Powell argues, by threatening that if he refused to plead, they would prosecute his son. The son, also named Michael Flynn, worked in General Flynn's private intelligence firm, which Team Mueller was scrutinizing over its alleged failure to register with the government as a foreign agent, a dubious allegation that was rarely handled as a criminal offense before Mueller's probe. So it goes on, but this whole case is starting to unravel, I think, before our eyes. And sadly, it's kind of being, the focus is still on COVID and on Trump's handling of COVID. So if you look at the New York Times and the Washington Post, these stories aren't really front and center. They're kind of buried. But if you look at The Hill and if you look at National Review, these stories are up there, and others, I'm sure, Breitbart and Daily Wire, etc. So it's interesting that, what chooses to get reported, and this is, common sense in today's world, and I'm sure you've observed it, but just simply choosing what to report can have consequences on people's understanding and awareness. Again, the principle of awareness. So having a wide range, a wide aperture of different sources can keep you aware of the choices being made on what to report. And this is one of my pet peeves, because there's a lot of stuff in the Christian missionary field that completely goes ignored by the American press. There's a publication called Voice of the Martyrs, which I got into 10 years ago, 15 years ago or so, and they'll routinely cover some of these really human interest stories in foreign countries involving missionary work, and in some cases, some persecution of Christians in other countries. So I'm very sensitive to this, choosing what to report and what not to report. Instead we'll be outraged about Jesse Smollett for several days, as opposed to reporting about a Christian missionary in Indonesia was beheaded by extremists. So anyway, I digress. But this field is opening up. This case is unraveling before our eyes. So I wanted to kind of figure out what the left was saying about this story. And like I said, it's hard to find them, but I did find one. And this, I think, comes courtesy of Real Clear Politics aggregator source. And this is from NBC News by Dean Obadala, host of the Dean Obadala Show. All right. This is about Michael Flynn. Keep in mind, this is about Michael Flynn and the case coming unraveled. This is how this piece starts. President Donald Trump has been accused of many things over his years in office. What? This is about Flynn, isn't it? Title: Trump's Twitter defense of Flynn shows he can sympathize, just not with coronavirus victims. Oh, got it. In this case, the story matches the article title. So the the left's take is to start with Trump and look at his tweets and compare his recent defense and Twitter and tweets. Compare that to the empathy he has exhibited to COVID suffering. Really? This boggles me. I mean, there's no engagement with the actual case. There's no engagement with the actual exculpatory evidence that's getting released to the public. If NBC decides to do this, I'd love to see it. If CNN and New York Times and Washington Post, they're going to have to. This is too big a story. They're going to engage with it, and it'll be interesting to see how they engage with it. Perhaps they already have, because I don't read every single article from those publications, but they may have already engaged with it. So that's what the left is saying. And I mentioned Jonathan Turley. I want to move on to Joe Biden now. So the big story this morning was Joe Biden was on Morning Joe, the two Joes, and where he unequivocally said it never happened, talking about Tara Reade's allegation of sexual misconduct. And I didn't watch it. I haven't watched it yet. But apparently later he said something to the effect of, why would this come out after 27 years? And I might not have noticed this, but why would he say it that way? Why would this come out after 27 years? Almost like there was something that could have come out earlier, maybe. Just a weird phrasing of his words. And Scott Adams pointed this out, that did he just confess? Anyway, I don't know. I'm not in the man's head, but I want to read this. This is from National Review. Biden asks Secretary of Senate to locate and make public Tara Reade sexual harassment complaint. So this is good. So he denies it on Joe this morning. Presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden said Friday that he wishes to make public the sexual harassment complaint filed by Tara Reade, the woman who says he sexually assaulted her decades ago when she worked for him in the Senate. Biden wrote to the Secretary of the Senate, Julie Adams, requesting assistance in determining whether 27 years ago a staff member in my United States Senate office filed a complaint alleging sexual harassment. I request that you take or direct whatever steps are necessary to establish the location of the records of this office, and once they have been located, to direct a search for the alleged complaint and to make public the results of that search, the former vice president wrote. I would ask that the public release include not only a complaint if one exists, but any and all other documents in the records that relate to the allegation. Okay, that's good. Good for him. So I think this is the current Secretary of the Senate. So presumably the records that are at the Senate now, as has been reported, a lot of his records from his Senate time were moved to the University of Delaware and archived and sealed until after he leaves public life. So Fox News reporting that Joe Biden's campaign dispatched operatives to the University of Delaware's library in the past year to rifle through his secretive Senate records there. Business Insider reported Thursday, raising the possibility they accessed documents related to Tara Reade's accusation that he sexually assaulted her when she worked for him in 1993. The development comes as both The Atlantic and The Washington Post argued that Biden should instruct the university to turn over the records, saying they could contain confirmation of any complaint Ms. Reade made, either through official congressional channels or to the 3 other employees she claims she informed, not specifically of the alleged assault, but more generally of harassment. So this source is basically saying between April 2019 and mid-March of this year, that some of Biden's people came and looked through the records of the University of Delaware. So it's not really clear when it happens. And of course, the allegation broke March 25th. So presumably it happened before that. So this is quite interesting development. But that story's not going away. I think Joe is going to continue to answer for this. And there's a lot of articles about how he supported reform in Title IX, sexual assault and sexual harassment allegations in universities, and reduced the evidential standard in those cases to preponderance of the evidence, as opposed to our usual beyond reasonable doubt standard, and assume innocence until proven guilty. So a lot of that stuff has been messed with in Joe Biden's tenure as vice president, and a lot of people are pointing that out in today's world. So we'll see how this story develops. Anyway, I think I've reached the end of my spiel. I'm about 58 minutes in. I hope you guys gained some value of this. Lots of big ideas. I really like those principles of fake news, the principles of awareness, discernment, sticky narratives, and omission. What's being covered, what's not being covered. Does the body of the article actually match the headline? Who would have thought you'd need to verify that? But that's something you definitely have to verify. And when you see it a few times, you'll realize how overwhelmingly common it is on both sides. And then is it too true to be true? And also, is it, that's really not likely that happened, so it probably didn't. So all these things should raise your awareness. If you emotionally connect to an article and you just get fired up with it, like my dad used to watching Fox News, those Democrats, pause. That's a trigger. That's a flag in your mind that should go up and say, let me chill out. Let me disengage. Let me kind of think critically about this issue. Let me brainstorm maybe some other sides. Maybe let me go investigate what the other sides are. And then I'll come in and I'll make a more reasonable, informed choice on my commitment of decision about this particular topic, as opposed to, adding this emotional reaction into your already sticky narrative. And therefore, it just makes that narrative a lot more firm and less flexible to contradictory evidence. I'd prefer to just keep it grown up. It's good to have our sticky narratives challenged on a regular basis. You can have convictions. You can have values. You can believe in God like I do. You can be a Christian like I am. But we could still have that friction and that pushing up against our narratives with the information we have coming in. So that's all I got. I hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'm going to do some shows, I think, on some issues maybe this weekend. We'll see. We'll see how the news cycle is. I might do a little news and mostly issues. I haven't decided yet, but stay tuned for that. Episode 30, woohoo! COVID Improvement Plan show. That's the brunt of it. I'm your host, Joel Van Brunt. Have a great night. Bye-bye.